Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and this is the Political Postbox, where I take a look at about half a dozen comments that have appeared on the channel from the past week, the most engaged ones, and add my own thoughts onto them. But first, if you'd like to stay notified of daily news in politics, then please subscribe to the channel and click the bell notification icon. So onto the first one, and this is related to the video I had on the EU publicly saying that an a Canada-style trade deal was not suitable for a deal between the EU and the UK. And I was making the comment that, although true, understand the reasons why it wasn't the most sensible way of phrasing it. Now, someone's saying here, I think you overestimate how much the EU cares about British public opinion, because, of course, I was making this out in terms of how it will play on the British. Now, what I would say to this is a few things. Depends what you mean by the EU. If you mean the general EU populations, that is the normal citizenry of the different EU member states, I'm sure that is more than true. Each individual country has, of course, its own troubles to deal with, and it would have had those troubles to deal with, Brexit or no Brexit. And at the moment, I am quite prepared to believe that most people in other countries, potentially not Ireland, but in most other countries, are looking at the situation and going, do you know what, it was quite entertaining for a while, but we're a bit sick of you and we've got other things to worry about. I get that. In terms of the EU Parliament, EU Commission and EU Council, I also get that an awful lot of them will have other serious issues to consider, and they're certainly not going to be focusing all of their time on Brexit. However, they will have to treat Brexit very seriously. Indeed, they are treating Brexit very seriously. I want you to consider the following. So we were trying to arrange a quick trade deal, or Boris Johnson was at any rate, but I have to say we, with Australia and the United States, amongst others. Australia and the United States, amongst others, have told us to bugger off. They are not talking to us. They are not talking to us about a trade deal. The EU are going to be next month, a couple of weeks. They've already published their negotiating position. We haven't done ours yet. We were supposed to. Haven't yet. Who's really surprised? Why? Because it is important to them. It is important to them. At the same time as they are also talking to Australia, they are also talking to the United States, others as well, in order to get that trade deal that they want with all the other countries. They are still allocating a negotiating team to us, and it's not a crap negotiating team. They're not just giving us the interns or anything like that. It's still being led by Michel Barnier, and so they are treating it seriously. Why? Because it is serious for them. Just as we are absolutely insane for thinking that we can do without close trading agreements with our closest neighbours, they're not that insane. They understand that actually that would be madness. Yes, they also sort of know that it's quite clear that Boris Johnson doesn't want a deal, but they also understand, and have said so as well, that it is important that they are not seen as the ones to derail it. If the EU collectively really didn't care about this, they would have withdrawn their own negotiating team. They would have just said to the UK, look, don't talk with anyone. Because we're not talking seriously with anyone at the moment. The only one we can say that we're about to start talks with is the EU. They could just say, do you know what? You're not being serious. Until you start to be consistent between what you are saying publicly and what you have committed to in your withdrawal agreement, there's no point in talking. Bugger off. I mean, I would understand that. I did the same this weekend on Twitter when someone was trying to argue and then kept trying to change the subject. It came to a point where I did what I always do in this situation, just say, look, you keep changing the subject. Will you address the points I've raised? I addressed yours. And if you don't, I'm not going to talk to you anymore. They could just do the same. And then the other thing to note as well is, yes, of course, all the different parts of the EU Council, Commission, Parliament have all got their own other things to be dealing with. Brexit is just one of them. But the negotiating team, led by Michel Barnier, is still the negotiating team. And they are entirely focused on Brexit. They have nothing to do with anything else. All of the other things that the EU collectively has to deal with is not what they have to deal with. They are entirely focused on a post-Brexit relationship with the UK. And so they will care about British public opinion, because at the end of the day, if British public opinion was was very much against what Boris Johnson was doing, like really heavily against it, he would have to change tack. At the same time, if he gets British public opinion on his side, then he feels empowered to carry on going that way. Like, if Boris Johnson reckoned he could swing with the British public, installing full border checks around everywhere, including inside the UK and the Irish Sea, as well as the food and medicine shortages, and he could somehow get people to go along with it because it wasn't his fault, he absolutely would. He absolutely would. So he, because he can be swayed by British public opinion, the EU should and indeed does care about it. So, I still stand by the fact that I just think they didn't play it quite as well as they could have done. Next one. Yellow vest, anyone? So this is referring to the idea that when 2020 is over and we go into 2021, which is the year of consequences for Brexit, there will be mass protests in Britain of the like you see in France with the Gilets jaunes, or just say yellow vest. My French not very good, sorry. And no, I've said it before and I'll say it again. No, you won't. One thing that's always been curious to me is when you actually get like Brexit supporters pointing to the yellow vest protests as evidence that the EU is collapsing because France, one of the now, what used to be one of the top 3 in the EU, now one of the top 2. Oh, and it's descending into chaos and France is in absolute, it's Armageddon there because you've got all these people protesting on the streets against Macron and the whole thing's collapsing. And you just look at them and you think, you have no idea, do you? This is normal in France. People actually saying to me, oh, these protests have been going on for months. They've been going on for over 200 years. This is ultimately the difference. Human nature is human nature. This is why I always say when people try and talk about, in the future of politics and not looking back and stuff like that, to a certain extent, yes, of course, and to a certain extent, only because society is changing and you have to keep up with society. And as well as technology, of course, which impacts society very, very seriously. But you have to look back because human nature is as it is. The way politicians win is using the same tried and trusted methods that have been used for thousands of years. Divide and rule. Keep messages simple. Keep a message simple to the people, to the masses. Keep it simple and they'll go along with it. Don't try and complicate a message to the people. Don't try and diversify it. They understand that. And they've understood it for millennia. But you also have cultural differences in different countries. I mean, the very strong protest you have in France is directly as a result of, in the French culture, as far as they're concerned, the government are their servants. They are there to do what they want to do. And they are not shy about holding them to that account. So as far as they're concerned, the government are there to do the people's will. So when the people, and obviously different groups of people will differ and disagree as to what the people want. But if you are a group of people in France and you don't believe the government are doing what you mandated them to do, they're not shy about saying so. Ultimately this goes back to the French Revolution, doesn't it? And these things have been going on forever. All my life I've been reading about these things. I can't remember a time when there wasn't some sort of aggressive, shall we say, certainly direct protest in France against the government about something by a particular group of people. And yes, they go on for a long time. Like I say, what is it, about 230, 240 years in counter? 230 years, I think, roughly. In Britain, different matter, particularly in England, because we didn't really have a British Revolution as such. We had an industrial revolution in Britain, which was a different thing. But, the English Revolution didn't really happen, did it? We had a civil war, which could have resulted in a revolution. It almost there, the wheels almost turned, and then they went back. So we had our civil war, chopped a king's head off, and Parliament, was going, we're supreme. And then a short while later, the parliamentarian who won that civil war was roundly criticised, told off, and then they got the dead king's son on the throne and said, look, we're sorry. I'm not saying nothing changed. Of course it did. But at the same time, we put the king back. We put everything back the way it was. It was like a Simpsons episode. So, and as a result, our culture is not one of direct protest all the time. Yes, you will see protests. You'll see marches. Sometimes you even see riots. They are usually triggered by a particular event, though, not usually by something government has done directly. But, you don't see them sustained. in the same way. You know, we'll have some dates where we go and march in London or somewhere else, depending. Obviously, at the moment, you'll be seeing over the course of this year various Scottish independence, pro-independence, or at least pro-referendum marches going on. And a lot of those will be going on, of course, in Scotland. So they're not always in London. But that's what you'll see. You'll see certain dates. What you won't really see is long-term. I mean, the Extinction Rebellion, you could argue, was a bit of a glimpse of it. But bearing in mind, that's not entirely British-based. A lot of British people involved, of course. But you don't really see protests like that in Britain much. And even then, it wasn't really sustained in the same way as in France. So, yeah, we're not going to see yellow vests in this country. We'll see protests, and I hope we see robust ones. We won't see anything like we do in France. Next one. So this is on the issue of the BBC, and my argument very much, every time they do something appalling, people keep saying, oh, this is why we need to abolish it. And my argument is no. I mean, two ways. First of all, if you get rid of the BBC, first of all, it's not going to just disappear. The void is going to be filled with other media. Those other media are far worse. But it's not even a case of better the devil you know. I mean, we know all of the devils, actually, but, you know, better this one. It's really a case of you don't... When something's not working, you don't just destroy it, you don't throw it away. You reform it, you fix it. That's what you should do. You know, destruction is not really ever going to be one of my policies. You always reform a system, unless it is completely without any sort of appeal at all. But what the BBC used to stand for, and what most of it still is, because we have to bear in mind what we're having a gripe at here is specific. It's not even the BBC News. It is the political team. That is a small part of the whole BBC. A small part that's letting the whole collective down. Most of the rest of the BBC is really a treasured institution. And it's just the fact that this arguably most important little tiny section of it is a rotten apple, potentially spoiling the barrel. But what you do is you just remove the rotten apple and put a good one back in. You don't have to throw all of the apples away before they're infected. So, yeah, I mean, for me, it's got to be reformed. Now, person here saying, German public TV and radio is controlled by a radio TV council comprised of representatives of different public interest groups, including politicians, a few, but also labour unions, employers' associations, artists, sports, churches, women for the countryside, etc. In other words, various special interest groups. The council does not vote on issues based on majorities, but on consensus for the most part, if I'm not totally mistaken. Would that be a solution for the BBC? Absolutely. In fact, you don't even have to go as far as that. The issue we have at the moment is not even that politicians are in charge of it. It's that a narrow interest group of politicians are in charge of it, i.e. the government. That's what needs removing. How does the government have such control over it? Largely because they control BBC funding indirectly, admittedly, but they do control BBC funding. Now, you need to remove that. In fact, and it's not just the BBC, I would argue, the police, judiciary and everyone. They all need to be removed from the government. Now, you cannot remove them from Parliament because they do need public funding. And obviously, we cannot expect anybody other than Parliament to fund a public body. So you do need, but you definitely need at the very least cross-party support. And yes, I'd absolutely be in favour of, let's say, a two-tier council for the BBC. We call it a board of governors at the moment, but expand it like a council. And your main one, your voting one, could be a select committee, a media select committee, cross-party MPs. And then the other ones could be the special interest groups that you talk about, who have a say in these meetings, don't necessarily have a vote. I wouldn't oppose them having a vote, but I sort of understand why you'd have to say it has to be elected MPs who decide ultimately funding matters. And because it's the threat of withdrawing funding that is the main problem. It's not the only one, because another thing that this body should really do is make sure we don't have the situation we have now, even before funding was threatened, whereby all of the, and I mean all of the senior members of the political news team are all card carrying conservatives. That is a huge problem as well. But I mean, this is what I mean. We've got a situation here. I didn't know this. We've got a situation in Germany where they have a system which would have prevented the sort of abuse we're seeing now. Could it apply to the BBC? Of course it could, yes. And indeed needs to. But that, as I say, I don't think that specific model is necessary in this country. But you just have to move it so that it's away from just a single interest group having control over it. That's what you need. Next one. So this is about the person who had her little diatribe on Question Time. Did a video on that, which came out on Sunday, I think, yesterday. It says here, you forgot one important thing. She's a known BNP Tommy Robinson supporter, and Question Time is still produced by someone who shared BNP posts. Whilst to the first point, forgot one thing, she's a known BNP Tommy Robinson supporter. At the time I did the video, I didn't actually know that. I did find out later. As someone else said, in a way, that doesn't actually matter. Because you could look at the situation with Question Time and say, well, for the members of the audience to be representative of the country, which is supposed to be what it is, they need to work harder on making sure it is genuinely representative. And yet that would mean about half the audience would be pro-Brexit and half would be, pro-EU and all the rest of it. But at the end of the day, as someone did point out, people apply to go on Question Time, and let's face facts, the people who are most likely to apply to go on Question Time are political activists. So that's what you're going to get. So you aren't going to get a representative sample of the country because, the representative population, by and large, doesn't really apply to go on programmes like that, even if they live close enough to the studio. But yes, she was a Tommy Robinson activist. For those who don't know who he is, he's like really on the extreme end. And that also, I mean, bear in mind that audience will have had a number of people in it who are still in favour of Brexit, because they always have. And I will say it again, I'll note it again, they didn't applaud what she said. And then when someone else came up with the EU caused the floods that we've had this last week, she was the only person who applauded that. The rest of the audience didn't applaud that. So the rest of the audience, even though they may have certain views in favour of Brexit, are not following the stupidest statements that are coming out. Remember, she is on the extreme edge of it. She doesn't represent the country. What is distressing is the number of people that I've seen in the comments on the video who seem to think she does. She seems to think this is Brexit Britain. It's not. There's an awful lot of lunacy in the country. I'm not downplaying the sheer number of people who have the wrong idea about all sorts of things. But her particular views are not widely shared at all. She is on the extreme end of it. She's just been given a megaphone. She's been given a megaphone in the first place by being on the programme. That just naturally would have happened anyway. Activists tend to be more extreme on either wing, or they tend to be more extreme in their politics because they get on that programme because they have a real interest, burning interest in politics. Secondly, they're giving her a megaphone because her lies weren't called out by the host. Thirdly, they're given a megaphone because the BBC not only didn't cut that out, and they do edit things out as well. Not only did they not edit that out, but also they promoted it in terms of getting people to watch it on iPlayer or whatever later on. They actively promoted that clip. They saw it as something that shows the programme in a good light, which is truly appalling. And in fact, I gather, breaches BBC editorial guidelines as well. So the programme has broken the rules by even trying to promote this thing. So, but yeah, I mean, sorry, I didn't forget. But in terms of Question Time being produced by someone who shares BNP posts, yeah, again, like I've said, the people in the most senior positions within the political wing of the BBC News are all very right-wing themselves, some extremely right-wing. I mean, even we point out Andrew Neil, which some people will defend him. I've had people defend him directly to me who've known him personally, saying he's, a journalist who takes his role very seriously. Okay, he's still very extreme right-wing. He is involved in The Spectator, which is it's like the British Breitbart, quite frankly. Anyway, Next one. So this was talking about the problem that farms are going to have in this country. There's an awful lot of industry going to have problems with the new immigration rules, assuming they even implement them. Bear in mind, we're all assuming that because they've announced these immigration rules that they're going to implement them. The Conservatives announce tough immigration policies all the time. They've never actually implemented one yet. They may do this one because they are a bit mad. And I was talking about the fact that the only way they're going to be able, because it's, you know, people are sort of saying, well, we can't get the EU migrants in to do this job of picking up the fruit and veg, so we're going to have to get British unemployed to do it. Well, there's plenty of them. I was pointing out they're not in those places. Like, they don't build farms in the middle of towns and cities very often. They're out the way. So the unemployed people are not located near them. You can't expect them to get there. And I was suggesting what you may have to do is, because not only are you going to have to employ more people to do this job, but because they won't do it as well, but also you're going to have to lay on transport for them. So someone's saying here, you might not have to bus people in every day. From reports I've seen discussing this, at least some of these farms have accommodation and facilities for the workers that until recently have been used by the temporary EU workers. Well, that is actually quite interesting. So now you could have a situation where not only will you be using slave labour to do this picking, what I mean by that is, of course, we wouldn't be talking about the farms offering jobs to British unemployed as long as they can physically get them there. They may do, and some, you know, decent farmers may do, but equally the system that the Conservatives themselves, starting with David Cameron, have introduced is you don't have to. You can just say, I'll tell you what, you've got a load of unemployed people. Why don't they come over here for some work experience, and then that'll pad out their CVs and help them get a job. Of course it won't, because there'll be fewer jobs because businesses will be doing this. So you get them there. The farm doesn't actually have to pay for them. They'll have to pay for something, whether it be buses or the accommodation, but they won't have to pay wages because they'll be just doing it for their benefits. So you'll be having it from that point of view. But on the other hand, you'll also be forcing them not only to take the job, but if it is some distance away and it's not realistic to bus them in every day, then saying, well, there's accommodation there, you can stay there. So that's nice, rip them away from their families as well, and their communities. Nice one. And, you know, and I know it can be simple to look at the situation and say, well, a large part of the demographic that would be worst affected by such a policy tend to be the ones that voted Brexit. But in actual fact, there'll be an awful lot who didn't as well that will be affected by this. But that is interesting. Yeah, I didn't actually know that. I suppose I should have thought of it at least. It does raise that prospect, doesn't it? Absolutely raises the prospect that that farm could say to the job centre, because there'll be huge pressure on the government to do something to fill those vacancies, and the government we have could easily take the view, well, if you've got accommodation there, we've got unemployed people here and they're taking housing benefit and all the rest of it, right, we'll get a load of them over there, you put them up and they'll do it for work experience, they'll do it for a month, take them away, we'll give you another lot, and you don't need it for the whole year anyway, it's seasonal. And it won't cost the farms anything other than the accommodation and potentially food, although you could even charge them for that even maybe. So the farms may not have to pay anything, and the government isn't paying any extra at all really either. And the people in the middle are the people who will have to be doing this picking of fruit and veg. Yeah, interesting thoughts. Anyway, last one I should say actually. So, someone describing the non-plan of Boris Johnson's government says, I fear they're a lot worse than that. I think dangerous and reckless. Knowing the chaos coming end of year with no agreement or poor agreement, throwing industry, manufacturers and exporters under the bus with delays and red tape at ports. Oh yeah, remember the fact that apparently we left the EU because there's too much bureaucracy there. Well, leaving it means even more bureaucracy. Who'd have thunk it? Actually, everyone who understands how the EU works. Or even has a vague idea, because I don't think too many people, myself included, really understands exactly the way it works. It says, with absolutely no preparation, no extra infrastructure to deal with all this change, even if we get a deal, there will be huge upgrades at ports with extra customs between Northern Ireland and Great Britain, but what so far? Nothing, absolutely nothing. Yes, indeed. The government are saying it's going to take until 2025. But we need them in 2021, but they won't be here till 2025, and they're totally fine with that. Oh, there's no contradiction in this statement at all. We need these new systems for 2021, right at the start of 2021. Yeah, they'll be online in 2025. Okay, what are we going to do in the other 4 and a bit years then? No answer to that. It says chaos is almost guaranteed now unless Boris Johnson government does a 180 turnaround and caves, but no sign of that just yet. I only see madness if we're not ready in time for even the most basic of plan ahead. Now, yes, I mean, there's a couple of things for me to say about this. First of all, the point I'll echo, which is completely different to the view I had in 2019. 2019, my view on the prospect of a no-deal Brexit was I was wholly against it. Not just because of all the forms of Brexit. It is the most damaging to the country. And it's always quite amusing and frustrating in some ways, but mostly amusing, when you've got the pro-Brexit crowd going, oh, just ignore him, he hates the UK, blah, blah, blah. No, I love the UK, which is why I don't want to see it destroyed. But, without this plan, as you say there, we are headed for absolute disaster. In 2019, I was just thinking of all the people who will suffer, the innocent people as well as the guilty people. And even the guilty people have families who are innocent, and they're going to suffer very, very badly indeed. And then I thought, no. Whereas now I take the view these people are going to suffer anyway. Come what may, Brexit or no Brexit, a Boris Johnson government, even if we'd have stayed in the EU, represents serious suffering to the most vulnerable people in this country. When I say the most vulnerable, I don't mean like the top 1% or anything. I mean the top 30, 40% even. Astounding levels of suffering are going to be inflicted. And once you accept that this suffering is going to happen, and I now have accepted it, then you have you're thinking along two lines. The suffering could happen, and Boris Johnson manages to convince everyone that it's just the way it is, nothing anyone can do about it. That would be a disaster, because that means at the next general election they'll vote for the same thing, even more suffering. Or the suffering could be extremely harsh and short, to the point where it is undeniable, and the cause of it is undeniable. And even though, yes, I know there are lots of people, it's a bit like Mark Twain said, an idiot will not be turned around by any amount of evidence. There will always be those people who will just carry on with their doublespeak, but a critical mass of people in this country just to see that Project Fear is Project Reality, and the public backlash could be absolutely momentous. That is now what I want, because at the end of the day, I now need people to see the consequences for what they are and assign responsibility to the correct people. And the only way that will happen, the only way, is for Boris Johnson to make a proper arse of everything. So every time something happens that makes me think it's not going according to his plan, I think that's good. Even though it not going according to his plan is even worse for us than if it did go according to his plan. It's like lots of suffering in the short term, and then hopefully we recover from it more quickly. Or do we want a situation that lasts for a generation or more, and causes actually over the long term more suffering, even if it's a lower rate of suffering? So that's the way I'm now viewing it. But the other thing is, you say chaos is almost guaranteed now unless Boris Johnson government does a 180 turnaround in caves. I mean, they may do. Yes, you're right. There is no sign of that just yet. I am taking the view at the moment that at the end of this year, we're out with no deal. But we don't really know that, because the problem is, every time Boris Johnson does something or something's reported about his actions or his instructions to his officials, as I was talking about in a video earlier today with the Irish border situation, you're getting the strong impression that he's basing what little plan he has on something that's not feasible. So then you ask yourself, so what happens once he accepts that it's not feasible? Once he accepts that it's not going to pan out as he expects, will he do a 180? He may do. This is possible. So the more he messes it up, from my point of view, the better. Because as I've said before, and I'm sure I'll say it again, I would much rather, if you've got someone evil in charge of anything, I would much rather they were incompetent and messed it all up than that they knew what they were doing. Because calculating evil is the worst. But anyway, those are the comments for this week. Hope you enjoyed them. If you did, don't forget to click the like button. And if you'd like to support the channel further, please also click the Patreon link for details. And until next time, I'll see you later.